course. Joining me now to discuss the developing background is David Sanger of the New York Times. He co-wrote today's front-page story on the subject. Also joining us later, Dune Lawrence of Bloomberg Businessweek, and from Washington, Michael Riley of Bloomberg Businessweek. This is an amazing story. One tower, 61398, is where the Chinese launched their sort of attack on learning everything they can.
So far, it's clear that they've been into those systems. It's not clear they've ever done anything with them.
Why are they doing this?
Now, that's the remarkable question, Charlie. Always the issue is intent and the degree to which the political leadership in China actually is knowledgeable about this and to what degree of control it has over it. Because Chinese command and control is not always what we imagine it from afar. In this case, Unit 61398, which is the major cyber intelligence unit for the PLA, but not their only cyber operation, is sort of their equivalent of the National Security Agency, or our Cyber Command, which is located at the National Security Agency in Fort Meade,
Run by
Maryland.
Kermit Alexander, is it?
That's right, right. And the American facility is both about monitoring what's happening around the world and attacks coming into the United States, and a growing offensive capability, and we can come back to that. In the Chinese case, what's been interesting is that most of their attacks, until recently, have not really been on government institutions or even the media. They've been on American corporations, sweeping up terabytes of data, whether it is Lockheed Martin, or whether it is a chemical company or something else.
New York Times?
The New York Times.
Washington Post?
That's part of the interesting change in recent times, that we have seen attacks on the Times, the Post, and the Wall Street Journal. In the case of the Times, we suspect, although it wasn't this unit, not the unit that we wrote about, a different group, we suspect that they were looking for sources of stories that David Barboza, one of my colleagues, wrote about the Chinese leadership.
Right.
Okay. We don't know that for a fact, but just looking at the patterns.
A very smart piece.
Right. This were a series of pieces about Wen Jiabao, the former prime minister, and his family fortune. Very sensitive issue in China. But there have been other cases in recent times where they have gone after the foreign policy elite of the United States. There was a fascinating attack on the Council on Foreign Relations here in New York, where the attack wasn't really aimed at getting material out of the Council's computer systems. Most of what's in there is openly available
They hope
papers.
so.
They hope. They'd probably be perfectly delighted if the Chinese went and read it all. But instead, it was what's called a watering hole attack. Think of animals coming to the watering hole. Well, in this case, the animals are the foreign policy elite. They see who's coming, and they follow them back home to their home computers. A fascinating element. There were attacks on the Aspen Institute that may have been a very similar kind of thing. And it's easy to imagine that attacks on the media could be the same thing as well, where they want to follow regular users of the website.
Now, do we assume that if they want to attack, they can find a way, they can hack into some degree or not?
You always have to assume that you could, and that it's not all that difficult to go do. What's remarkable about the report that was done by Mandiant, which is the one you referred to, it's a computer security firm. It's one that the Times brought in when it was attacked by a different Chinese group. But this report followed a couple of individual hackers who worked for a group that called itself Comment Crew.
Right.
Got that name because they put their malware, the malicious code, inside the comment section of web pages and hid it there. And once this got into a computer system, it's not like they were in and out in a day. They would stay around for an average of a year.
Yeah.
Sometimes several years. So it's
doing
this.
What?
Well, mostly sucking up lots of data.
Right.
There is one Comment Crew attack that we described in this morning's story that was aimed at a small Canadian company called, or this Canadian subsidiary of a company called Telvent, that actually runs the oil and gas pipelines that run through the United States and down into Mexico. To say they run it, it is to say they design the software that turns on and off the valves remotely. It's interesting to wonder what it is that Comment Crew wanted to learn from being able to turn on and off those valves.
Now, you say they have been active since 2006.
Comment Crew has been active for a long time and is probably the group that is responsible for the widest number of attacks. But when you chart the attacks, and we put a chart in the paper today and on our website, what you discover is they escalated dramatically starting sometime in 2010, running through the past 2 years.
So what is the United States going to do about this?
Well, that is a very difficult question because this is different than the old Cold War spy versus spy stuff that you think about in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, where, you would find a Soviet spy over at the United Nations looking at American defense facilities, and after it got egregious enough, they would throw them out of the country, and then the Russians would throw a few Americans out of the country. In this case, we've got one of America's largest economic partners, one of its largest competitors, a country with which we have many other equities. We're worried about the South China Sea. We're worried about other claims that the Chinese are making. Worried about the military competition. So the cyber has always sort of been off at the side as something of an annoyance. What's happening now is that for the first time, I'm hearing senior government officials tell me, many of them, this has gotten so big that it is moving to the center of the relationship, and it risks the rest of the relationship. And I think the next thing you're going to see is the president send some kind of envoy to Beijing to make that point.
To say to them, stop it, or?
That's the problem. It's the or what. Okay? So what happens every time they have these meetings? And I've spoken to many government officials who've sat through many of these meetings with the Chinese. They come in and they say, we've got a big problem, and we think maybe your army is involved. And they look and they say, oh, we're victims of cyber attacks ourselves. Look at all of our different institutions that have gotten attacked, and I'm sure some of them have, right? And then they start talking about this as like, you've got drug dealers, we've got drug dealers, we really ought to come up with a drug policy. Now, if the Obama administration is going to make a difference now, they're going to have to make it clear that there is some kind of a price for this, because right now, there really is no price for it. There's no government regulation of it. There are no treaties. One of the reasons that the U.S. government does not get into treaties on cyber is it doesn't want to admit that it's got cyber offensive weapons of its own.
Is it also like the situation in which as soon as you develop some kind of security, they develop some way to pierce that security? Because as you get sophisticated, they get sophisticated.
It is, Charlie, and in that regard, it's a little bit like the days when the Russians developed missiles and we developed anti-missile systems, and then they developed systems to defeat the anti-missile. Right. So there's always that escalation. But in this case, it's much more of an asymmetric war because the Chinese have lots more to learn from us. Designs, blueprints, software, just because of the relative status of the economies, the point of development, then the United States has to learn from China. That isn't to say we have nothing to learn from inside the Chinese elements, but right now the Chinese have more to learn. And American officials tell me that if the U.S. has cyber weapons, as if there's much doubt on that subject after what the U.S. did to Iran, but if the U.S. has cyber weapons, it would not employ them on the behalf of American companies. They would simply use it for national security threats, whereas the Chinese seem perfectly happy to use them on behalf of state-run companies and perhaps...
But most of the Chinese attacks are by governments who then give the information to private or to companies?
Some government,
private,
but some contractors. I mean, this is the fascinating thing of untangling Unit 61398. The reason we went about leaping on the very good work that Mandy did in this report and then going out and talking to people in the intelligence community, other experts, is that until now, everybody has assumed the Chinese military has some role in this, but they've never sort of taken it to the front door. What the Mandiant report did was it isolated it down to a neighborhood, the one that you read about. They couldn't go in the door of that 12-story building, but all of the digital breadcrumbs led them right to the neighborhood. So it's either that building or the noodle shops around it.
I think Mike Rogers said in your piece, maybe, the Republican chairman of the Intelligence Committee, said that the only way to, you've got to have, this will continue to accelerate unless you can figure out a way to stop it.
That's right.
You've got to have something that you can say to the Chinese that will compel them to stop it. What might that be?